Every year, thousands of high school students go to their graduation, like many have done just last week or two, and they receive their high school diplomas. Once they get that document, well, what do they do then? A number of them prepare for a job in the real world. Others further their schooling in college or in a trade school. Some may even enter the military. There could be a number of other things that they do. And for most high school students, it's an exciting time. They've completed a major chapter of their life, and now they're ready to move on to something else. Well, back in 2013, there was one high school graduate who stood out from the rest of his class and also stood out from all the high school graduates in this nation. His name was Fred Butler, and he stood out because he wasn't 17 or 18 years old graduating high school. He was 106 years old when he got his diploma. He is the oldest male on record to receive a diploma. And you might wonder, how does this happen? Well, when he was a teenager, naturally the early 20th century, the early 1900s, he was forced to quit school after the 8th grade in order to help his family make ends meet. And many had to do that back then, and he was one of them. In time, he enlisted in the Army. He fought in World War II. When he got out of the war, came back to the States, got married, started a family, had some children. He worked for the city water department. Sort of your all-American, story was Fred Butler. He saw the value in getting a good education because it was something that he felt he lacked through all the years. And as happens with many of us, he wanted to get that diploma, but life gets in the way. Like I said, he got married, then you have kids and all the responsibilities with that, and then working and so forth. But Fred took the death of his wife hard in the 2000s, and whenever his wife passed away, one of his children suggested that he go back to school and get that diploma, sort of a way to pass time in a productive manner too. It was a great idea, and Fred was on board with it, and pretty much the rest is history. He got that diploma, the oldest person to ever do so. But the moral of the story is that there are many times in our lives when life throws things at us that knock us down, but it's up to us to get up, dust ourselves off, and make the best of it. And that's what brings us to the Bible this morning. As we continue in the book of Zechariah, we're in chapter 4 this morning. We did some of chapter 3 last week. This is where the exiles were brought back from Babylon. They were released from their captivity, and now they had their eyes focused on building a new life in Jerusalem, a place where many of them never were before, but it always was their home. So they began rebuilding the temple, for one thing, in Jerusalem. That was destroyed before the city was captured and their ancestors were taken away. They knew they needed a place to worship. So again, the temple is one of the most important things to get started on. But as often happens, doesn't happen easily. They face strong opposition from a variety of different people, and the project was shelved. They stopped building for several years. They had the foundation laid, but not much else. So that leads to Zechariah today, where today the prophet is given a vision with the intent of encouraging the Jewish people to finish rebuilding that temple first of all. And this chapter introduces us to an interesting character, sort of a tongue twister kind of a name, Zerubbabel. Okay, whenever we were pregnant, this was not on the short list of names for a boy. But not that it's a bad name, it just has naturally gone out of style. And we'll look at him in depth later. But for now, just know he was the guy in charge. He was the guy sort of like the governor of the people. And God chose him to spearhead this project of finishing building the temple. And the Bible tells us that he even started rebuilding the temple, but naturally, guess what? More opposition came and they had to stop it once again. And so this prophecy is given as encouragement to resume. So if you're following in your pew Bible, you'll find it on page 670. Reading in chapter 4, we'll read the first 10 verses. So beginning in verse 1, it says, "Then the angel who talked with me returned and awakened me, as a man is wakened from his sleep. He asked me, 'What do you see?' I answered, 'I see a solid gold lampstand with a bowl at the top and 7 lights on it, with 7 channels to the lights. Also there are 2 olive trees by it, one on the right of the bowl and the other on its left.' I asked the angel who talked with me, 'What are these, my Lord?' He answered, 'Do you not know what these are?' 'No, my Lord,' I replied. So he said to me, 'This is the word of the Lord to Zerubbabel. Not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord Almighty. What are you, O mighty mountain? Before Zerubbabel you will become level ground. Then he will bring out the capstone to shouts of, 'God bless it, God bless it.' Then the word of the Lord came to me. The hands of Zerubbabel have laid the foundation of this temple. His hands will also complete it. Then you will know that the Lord Almighty has sent me to you. Who despises the day of small things? Men will rejoice when they see the plumb line in the hand of Zerubbabel. These 7 are the eyes of the Lord, which range throughout the earth." May the Lord's blessing be added to the reading and hearing of his holy word. It's a very strange image. You could actually go home this afternoon and Google pictures of Zechariah 4, or this, you try to put a description, and you can see different artist renderings, which is actually pretty helpful. Don't know exactly how it looked, but based on the description, there's some pretty good ones out there. But this strange image is actually very encouraging for the church. First, it starts with 2 olive trees. And in biblical Israel, the olive tree was very significant. It provided a lot of what they needed just for everyday life. It provided food. It provided oil that they could burn for fuel and for heat and all that. It provided medicine for healing. It provided wood, naturally, for shelter. So a lot of things in ways that it sustained people. And best yet, the olive trees grew every year. It replenished when you cut one down and so forth. So you have these trees on each side, and they are feeding oil into this bowl that lights 7 flames, which is a constant source of fuel for it. The angel tells Zechariah that the trees then represent the message to Zerubbabel, not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit. And in verse 7 of this chapter, some rather encouraging words are, "What are you, O mighty mountain? Before Zerubbabel you shall become level ground." Well, with God's Spirit leading them, Zerubbabel can basically flatten any mountain that comes in his way and make it like level ground and just obliterate it in the name of God. Where we get this, or I would say, where do we get this same sentiment expressed somewhere else in the Bible? Well, you might be more familiar with the New Testament. In Matthew chapter 17, Jesus famously talks about mountains too, where he says, "Truly I tell you, if you have faith like the grain of a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you." So it's a very similar promise that God is giving to Zerubbabel. And imagine this, happening in front of your very eyes. One day there was this big problem, and all of a sudden, God got rid of it. He provided a way. And I would ask everybody here, do mountains get in the way of the things that you need to do on a daily basis? Do they get in the way of you accomplishing big things for God? Could be relational problems. It could be financial issues, emotional baggage gets in the way, a number of other things. I mean, you can mention a bunch of things to me that I'm not even mentioning here. Is it the fear of failure or rejection? That could be a big mountain. Can you imagine God intervening personally into your life because he has something in mind that he wants you to do? And so he says, what are you, O mighty mountain? Basically saying, you're nothing to me. You are not stronger than God. In other words, whatever seems so serious in your life on one day seems like a massive mountain is just gone before you know it. It's the kind of power that God has, and sometimes we lose focus of that. And it's a wonderful reminder that God gives to Zerubbabel. We see why God has this wonderful promise. Zerubbabel is an Old Testament saint that doesn't get a lot of notoriety, doesn't get a lot of focus, not even a lot of respect that he deserves when you consider all the things that he's been through. We think of the big names in the Bible, and he's just, not many people are going to mention him. Sort of thinking to modern days, sort of the Rodney Dangerfield of the Old Testament. He gets no respect, that kind of a thing. But his story, like everybody else, doesn't occur in a bubble, okay? We're reading Zechariah chapter 4, but believe it or not, he's mentioned over 20 times in the Old Testament. And so if you go and look at some of those other books, then we sort of get a picture of what Paul Harvey called the rest of the story. When we see how everything else fits together, it enhances our understanding of what he was dealing with and everything that was going on. Now, there's I'll read for you here a brief passage from a book written by a Bible scholar named G. Ernest Wright back in the 1970s, so an older book. It was called Great People of the Bible and How They Lived, and he shined some light on the situation that these people were dealing with coming from Babylon back to Jerusalem, and it was basically a vacant wilderness. He wrote, "The actual return was a crushing disappointment. The returning exiles found Judah a wilderness and the holy city a wasteland. Corruption was everywhere, even among the priesthood. The descendants of those who had escaped captivity were hostile to the newcomers, fearing that their Babylonian brethren might try to recover their former family properties." End quote. So, in other words, during their time in Babylon, these exiled Jews clung to the hope that one day they would return to their homeland. But when they got there, things were certainly not as they expected and not in good shape at all. Actually, the book of Ezra talks about this and fills in some of the gaps in more detail. It says about how once they resolved to rebuild the temple, the enemies came alongside and they offered to help them rebuild. Well, would you take help from your sworn enemies? Probably not, and that made the enemies rather upset with them. The Jews basically said, thanks but no thanks. So the enemies went and wrote a letter to the king who governed the area, and they told a bunch of lies about the Jewish people at the time. They were telling him that they were wicked people, and worse yet, they had no intention of paying their taxes. If you want to get a king's attention, tell him people aren't going to pay their taxes, and he's going to make sure that things change. So the king responds with this letter ordering them to stop building that temple immediately. So after 15 years of a stalemate, God then sends messages to a few different prophets, not just Zechariah. He sends one to Haggai as well. And he tells him to tell Zerubbabel to resume this work. He says, okay, enough is enough. We're getting to the Lord's work, and we're not going to let anything get in the way. And this is where Ezra and Zechariah connect. If you want to take notes or whatever, jot down Ezra chapter 4. You would find it says about how the work on the house of God in Jerusalem stopped, and it ceased until the second year of Darius, king of Persia. Well, in Zechariah, it also references that same second year of Darius. So we know this is exactly what they're talking about. And it's like God's telling Zerubbabel, you stop building, you do have a foundation there, and maybe there was a good reason why you had to stop. I mean, the king ordered you to stop, so sort of couldn't get around that too much. But now I just want you to pick up the pieces and get this done once and for all. Now, think of building any kind of a structure or a house. Okay, nowadays we have, more fancy equipment to do it, but a very basic structure is so obvious. You build it brick by brick. You lay one brick, that's more of the cornerstone, and that's where you want to center the whole property around, or the building. Then you simply lay one brick next to that, and that looks good, and you do a third and a fourth naturally. So you have to start somewhere. And it's a tedious process too. And this goes beyond our modern culture where we want things fast. People have always wanted things to be done fast. We have more ability to do that now. So we don't like things that take a lot of time. They can be boring. You don't see progress made, those kind of things. But you have to build a wall slowly and properly, so that it will be sturdy and it'll suit your purposes. And God's telling Zerubbabel that the work on the temple, just think it's a series of bricks, and every day you're going to add to it, and you're going to make progress, and before you know it, you're going to be done. And this is what the message from God says in verse 10. Who despises the small things? And he says, men rejoice. Well, it means, again, we may not like the slow process, but when it's finished, we are going to be so happy that we invested the time and effort and energy in it. It's an obvious picture of the church. The finished temple is much more than the sum of its parts. Our church building here, we don't think of it as 4 ceiling lights, 2 ceiling fans, the clocks on the wall, all this kind of stuff. This is a church when it's put together in a certain way, serving a certain purpose. And the church, that's the church building. And so we know that the church is more than just the building, it's the people in the building, and it's more than every individual person here, because together we make up something much greater than the sum of our parts. I'm not sure if I'm going out here, but I will talk loud from this point. Okay, all of a sudden. Again, we can do things individually, and we can do so much more together. As we said during the offering, we get to support missionaries going all throughout the world, those kind of things. And we can just accomplish so much more together. That's why we come together every week or so. See how we're doing. Lift each other up in prayer. If anyone has any ideas for future ministry opportunities, we could do that. All these kind of things. It's just so much better together than individually. And that's what people are missing out when they insist on staying home Sunday morning and not coming to church. Of course they say, I can pray and worship as easily in the comfort of my own home as I can in a church. Well, if you read the Bible, I don't think there's ever an instance where Jesus ministered inside his own home. I'm sure he did it, but that's not the focus of his ministry. If you're praying at home, that's fine, and we should do that. But if that's all that we are doing inside our own home, where's the outreach? How are we reaching people by doing those things? Whatever we're doing in our lives, that should be the question. Where is the outreach? Whenever you just insist on staying home and isolating yourself from other people, how are you encouraging other people in the faith? there's nothing that can genuinely replace face-to-face contact with other believers on a regular basis. It just doesn't happen. And we know that we have shut-ins, and that's why we need to be making the effort to reach out to them, because it's not always feasible for people to come to church, but I'm talking about the people who just refuse to come to church. And as I mentioned, in Arizona, their church just opened up like a month ago. Okay, many churches were closed due to the virus last year. We were closed for, I think, 6 weeks or so. And something can be said for making that effort to get back into the routine as soon as possible. And again, not that it was bad to close, and different churches closed for different reasons and for different lengths of time. But I will say the enemy was quick to use 2020 and all the things that happened in 2020 for his benefit. Closing churches down. There were some states and some cities that actually made edicts that churches had to be closed, and they were sued, and it was just a whole mess. But a lot of 2020 served the enemy's purposes. So it's now up to the church to undo some of that and pick up where we left off and move ahead. Again, it did so much for the enemy. It put fear in people's hearts. Many people died. The enemy comes to kill, steal, and destroy. And he did a lot of that last year. And as I mentioned, disrupting the church is at the top of the enemy's list. He accomplished all those things to certain degrees last year. He wants people to get used to not going to church, not ministering, and those kind of things. That's how important it is that the enemy's latching on to all these things and using them for his benefit. So what it says in Zechariah, the small things. You might not think an hour in church on Sunday is a lot, but it means a lot. When you're in the routine and you really thrive on that, when you don't have it, I know with me, it just throws the rest of my week out of whack. Just like the people who came back from Babylon now to Jerusalem, they heard all these stories from years ago. The lavish temple, it was destroyed. That temple was built by the great King Solomon, son of the greater King David. And then they went to build the second temple, and it turns out the second temple, smaller than the first. Maybe not as nice on the outside. So that was sort of, something they were hoping they could have, done a little better. Maybe they needed that humility, though, for that time in their lives, because oftentimes humility comes along with God's blessings, too. Despite the smaller size of that second temple, history tells us that the second temple lasted longer than the first one did. We're talking about the 500 some BC. It lasted until 70 AD. So almost 600, more or less 600 years. I think the first temple was about maybe 400 years. But Zerubbabel, he faced this opposition to rebuild from within and without, both. It's always tougher to be in a situation when even your own people aren't happy with the way things are going. We also know that he faced a significant amount of opposition from his enemies naturally, but despite that, God sent his Spirit and he encouraged him that he's going to flatten any mountain that gets in his way from doing the work that God called him to do. God knew that this was important, and so God was gracious enough to remind him of this fact too. And if you read the rest of the story, you find out that after the 15-year layoff, within less than 4 years it took to complete it. They could have had that temple built almost 10 years before. I hope as we look at Zerubbabel, this guy that maybe some of you have never heard of before, or maybe you read the Bible, you didn't know how to pronounce his name. He was a great Old Testament saint who was chosen by God for the specific task of rebuilding the temple. And we see how he did that amid this opposition all around him. Not so much different from the guy I opened with, Frank Butler, going to get his high school diploma at 106 years old, forced to quit school after the 8th grade, circumstances beyond his control. Not all that different from Zerubbabel. All these things, circumstances beyond his control. Hey, Frank Butler waited almost 90 years to get his diploma. Zerubbabel just waited 15 or so to start the rebuild, and within 20 it was completed. But for both of them, Frank Butler and Zerubbabel, it took a person to come alongside and encourage him to finish the work. God opened the doors, he made it clear to them, and the rest is history. I would say this morning that especially if there is something in your life that maybe you started and you sort of put on hold for a while for whatever reason, revisit that and see if it's worth doing, especially if it's going to honor God and maybe do his will. I encourage you to make that commitment and take that first step in faith. It always starts with one step. And it is always hardest getting started and taking that first step. As I said, if it's God's purpose, then pursue it. Go for it. If the thing, that you want to pursue is in the will of God, it's just like the situation with Zerubbabel, where he says, not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit. And that tells us we aren't doing it alone. God is with us. And remember these words, what are you, O mighty mountain? Because these mountains are all around us. Each of us, I'm sure, has a number of them, but they can be made to level ground if we ask God and walk in his ways. And when we do so, we learn so much through the experience. We can see how capable we are when we are walking with God. These obstacles that seem so big are just wiped off the face of the earth. And it empowers us then to step out in faith and transforms us into better people. So every way you look at it, it is a benefit. We become better people than we ever thought we could be because God is with us. Let's close now with a word of prayer.